Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on the History Bible podcast, and today I'm joined by Professor Helen Bond. And today we're going to be discussing her presentation in the New Insights into the New Testament 2025, called "The Last Hours of Jesus: What Really Happened." So, Helen, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Jacob. It's lovely to see you again.
And the link to purchase it will be in the description below and the pinned comment. And I'll remind everybody again at the end of the recording. I also want to remind everyone real quick that there is a early bird pricing going on, but it ends on September 13th. So if you want to purchase access the NINT 2025, do so now while there's still time to save some money. You also have different options presented to you here. You can get the standard, the VIP, or the elite. And you can see that all of them are on sale right now. Again, early bird pricing, so you save a little bit of money if you purchase through one of these now. Again, the link will be in the description below and also in the pinned comment. So can you tell us a bit about what you think happened in regards to the last hours of Jesus?
Yeah, well, I want to spend quite a lot of time talking about the different gospels because, we tend to have this sort of harmonized picture of what happened, the trials of Jesus that gets reinforced by films and things like that. But actually, each of the gospels is really different in terms of the way it presents the trial. In Mark, you have a kind of a double trial, a Jewish trial, a Roman trial. Only Luke has the trial in front of Herod Antipas. Only Matthew has only Matthew has Pontius Pilate washing his hands, that cry of all the people. John is different again. So all of these are very much linked up with a particular theological outlook of the Gospels. So I think it's worth kind of spending a bit of time in the presentation. I'll be looking at that and saying, what is the author trying to do by this? But when you think about it historically, I mean, the only things that are common to sort of all of the Gospels really are the fact that Jesus is crucified, which clearly means that this is a Roman form of execution, perhaps some sort of involvement by the Jewish high priests, the priestly aristocracy. And broadly, I mean, everything else is very difficult to know whether it actually happened historically or whether it's part of the theological agenda of the Gospels. So the main thing we know is that if Jesus was crucified, then it was clearly at the orders of the Roman governor. So that's kind of the main thing I think to take away.
And before we continue on that, can you tell everyone real quick what is the New Insights into the New Testament about? Can you tell everybody what that's about?
Oh, the conference altogether. Well, I
Yep.
think it's very exciting. It's a sort of a weekend of a range of scholars talking about their passions, what they find really interesting about Jesus, and everybody has their own angle on things, and it's something that they've been working on. I suppose in my own uh, point perspective, I've been working on the trial of Jesus for a very long time, ever since I did my PhD. So this is something that I have a long-standing interest in. But people are choosing different things, and I think it'll be a really exciting weekend.
So the next thing I'd like to ask is how does a scholar such as yourself go about sifting through the gospel text when it comes to like the last hours of Jesus or just other material, the gospels in general?
Mm.
Um, how does one tell when it's being historically accurate or if it's being embellished due to a theological or literary agenda?
Yeah, that's a really difficult thing. And of course, just because something is theological doesn't necessarily mean it's not historical. So the gospel writers might have deliberately chosen one thing rather than another. Because it fits their presentation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is made up just because it sort of fits a theological agenda. So I think the difficulty is just sort of looking at the different gospel accounts and sifting through what does seem to be likely to be historical, what seems to be made up. I mean, in the case of the trial in front of Herod Antipas, for example, in Luke's gospel, only there in Luke, Luke is very keen to have the representative of Roman power, Pontius Pilate, saying three times, "I find no guilt in him." So three times he says Jesus is innocent, and I think that's enhanced by the picture of Antipas that you have in there too, because then you get a second high status Jewish male sending Jesus back to Pilate because he finds no guilt in him. So that's kind of two voices for Jesus's innocence. So that does seem to me to be more of a theological agenda, particularly when you only get it in Luke. And so I'd be a little bit skeptical as to whether that actually sort of happened historically. And I think it's a question of going through all of the examples like that. Pilate's washing his hands. Well, we only get it in Luke. It seems to be very much a Jewish thing. Seems a strange thing for a Roman governor to do. So I would be a little bit suspicious about that too. And of course, we have the whole works of Josephus, which give us an amazing insight actually into first century Judea and life at that time, particularly from the perspective of the elite, which is whose eyes we need to look at this from, because it's the elite that sent Jesus to the cross. So Josephus is really interesting in terms of how he describes that power balance between the Roman governors and the Jewish chief priestly aristocracy. So we've got quite a lot of evidence there, I think, to sort of to guide us along too, actually, with a few specific cases that we know of and can compare with Jesus.
How likely is it that Jesus had a Jewish trial?
Um, I think it's probably unlikely. I mean, it depends what you mean by Jewish trial. In Mark's gospel, you have this impression that the whole council has got together. There's a verdict. There's witnesses called. But even in Mark's gospel itself, it's sort of strange because you get a verdict and then suddenly Jesus is sent to Rome and the whole trial starts again. So I think you have to be a little bit skeptical about this. The Gospels are also written at a time after the Jewish War when Christians are trying to put blame for Jesus's death onto the shoulders of the Jewish leaders. And I think they sort of made them enhance the level of trial here. I think it's quite likely that the Jewish priestly aristocrats were worried about Jesus. He's been doing things in Galilee. He's stirring up people. He's got large followings. There's some kind of triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Worst of all, he does something in the temple. And who knows where that might lead? They wouldn't know what's he going to do next. This is a really difficult time. It's Passover. The city of Jerusalem is full to bursting. What's going to happen? You've got Roman troops there on hand just in case there's any kind of riot or insurrection. So I don't think it's at all surprising that the Jewish priestly aristocrats were worried about Jesus, and they would have been on good terms with Rome. Even though Rome was in charge, I think Rome would have been interested in hearing the Jewish leaders' take on things. But my assumption is that the Romans would probably have wanted to get rid of Jesus anyway. They would have had their own system of spies and informers. They'd have known a lot about Jesus, even if this is genuinely his first time in Jerusalem, as Mark seems to imply. I think they'd have known a lot about him and just wouldn't have wanted a troublemaker at the feast. I mean, life is very, very cheap if you're a Roman governor, and better just to get rid of a annoying provincial rather than allow things to escalate and then trouble to brew.
Who was Pontius Pilate, and is there a problem with the way the Gospels portray him?
Yeah, so Pontius Pilate is the fifth Roman governor of Judea. He would have been a military man. It's essentially a military posting. He's prefect, which means that Judea has only been a Roman province for 20 years, or it's not even clear whether it was a full province. It might have been affiliated to the larger province of Syria. So Pontius Pilate's job really is to keep law and order, to make sure that the natives know who's boss, and really just to keep control, to watch out for riots and things like that. And so I think that's another reason why he's particularly interested in a potential troublemaker like Jesus. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the picture that we have in the Gospels tends to sort of to show Pilate in perhaps a better light than he might otherwise have been. We know from Josephus, and particularly from Philo, that Pilate was a no nonsense, harsh kind of figure. He's exactly what you imagine a Roman governor to be. He's insensitive. He just kind of deals with things quickly. He doesn't want things to escalate. Philo, in particular, gives a very negative picture of him, though, of course, you can't trust Josephus and Philo any more than you can trust the Gospels on Pilate's character, because they also, as Jewish writers, weren't very keen on the Roman governors. But I think this whole thing about Pilate saying that he doesn't find any guilt in Jesus and sort of being pushed into things by the Jewish leaders is clearly part of the strategy of early Christians, who are really wanting to show that although the leader of this new movement was executed by Rome, he wasn't guilty under Roman law. So that's a really important thing for them, because most of the new converts are coming from the Roman world. So, they like this message, they like the teaching of Jesus, but it becomes very difficult by the time you say, yes, but this Jesus was crucified. And the strategy is to say, well, it wasn't actually Pilate, it was the Jewish leaders. Now, I don't think that's a very positive picture of Pilate. People sometimes say, oh, Pilate is positive and weak in the Gospels. Actually, I think it's a very poor picture of a Roman governor who can't keep order in his own court. But I think that's the strategy they use to try and sort of deflect as much blame for Jesus's crucifixion onto the Jewish leaders.
Did Pilate need to try Jesus?
No, no, not at all. I mean, Pilate doesn't need to do anything. In fact, it doesn't even have to come up the chain of command as far as Pilate um, for Jesus to be sent to the cross. It could easily have been the case that Pilate or some other subordinate let it be known that if this Galilean caused any trouble, he was to be dealt with quickly and just put on a cross. But on the other hand, it may well be that, given the sort of the potentially volatile time of Passover, Pilate may have wanted to see him himself. I think what's particularly likely is that Pilate wanted to reassure himself that all he needed to do was to get rid of Jesus. Was it just a question of getting rid of Jesus and then the movement is going to become quiet? Or did he need to get rid of a few others? And, how much of a threat actually is Jesus and the movement that he's heading? So I think some sort of brief interrogation is perfectly plausible. And actually, there's a very similar case of another Jesus in the 60s that we know about from Josephus, who says that this guy, he was prophesying against the temple in the 60s. The Jewish leaders brought him to the Roman governor, Albinus, and Albinus sort of, met with him, chatted with him, decided he was mad, and had him flogged, and then Jesus just went back up to the temple and carried on prophesying its destruction. And I think that's quite interesting because it's a very similar kind of way of operating to what you have in Jesus of Nazareth. It's the important people of the day um, having some kind of a face-to-face interrogation with him, deciding the level um, of of punishment, and then sort of moving on. So I don't think it's impossible that Pilate had some kind of a hearing.
Why include Barabbas?
So Barabbas, yes. Well, Barabbas is really an interesting character because his name, of course, Barabbas, means son of the father. And in Matthew's gospel, the similarities are even stronger because he's known there as Jesus Barabbas, Jesus, son of the Father, which sounds suspiciously like our Jesus of Nazareth. So I think there's sort of this similarity between them, and certainly Matthew and Mark really play up this similarity and the element of choice. So in Mark's gospel, he makes it clear that there's this Passover amnesty, this sort of custom whereby the Roman governor allows the people to choose one prisoner, and then the question is, who do they want? Jesus or Barabbas, the son of the father. And Barabbas, we're told, is in the prison because he's been picked up in some insurrection in the city. And I think if you read this after the fall of Jerusalem, after 70, when of course there's been huge amounts of warfare, insurrection, where the people generally have followed um, these warlike men, and it's led to disaster, disaster for the city, disaster for the temple. This could be Mark's way of saying, the people all shout for Jesus, the Son of the Father, Jesus, the insurrectionist. But really, the one they should have followed, the one that the true son, the true King of the Jews, is actually Jesus. So I think there's maybe a kind of a comparison going on there. Matthew makes it even clearer by adding in Jesus, Barabbas, and Barabbas keeps on there. He's just there in Luke, and he's there in John in a much more sort of truncated way. And then, of course, you have to ask: is Barabbas just a figment of Mark's imagination? Did he make him up? Um, or is there some sort of historical basis to it? And I do tend to think that there's probably some historical basis there. Maybe there was another prisoner. Maybe he was called Barabbas or something similar. Maybe he was released around about the time of Jesus. Doesn't have to be as part of Jesus's trial, but maybe there wasn't evidence against him. Maybe the governor just decided that he wasn't guilty of anything. He could be released, and maybe Christians started to speculate on the unfairness that their Jesus had been sent to the cross and this other guy had got away. So there could be some sort of traditional basis to it at the bottom of it all, but we really don't know. I mean, we have no reference to Barabbas anywhere else other than the Gospels. Josephus doesn't mention him, though we know that rebels were just a feature of the first century.
And was Jesus really buried in a rich man's tomb?
Ah, it's difficult to know because victims of crucifixion were normally not buried, and that's all part of the horrific nature of it all. That not only are you crucified naked and shamed by all of that, but your body doesn't have a decent burial, and that's all part of the horror of crucifixion. But we do know that some people sometimes were buried. There's that very famous ankle bone that was found in 1968 in Jerusalem. Yehohanan, who has this sort of the iron nail still in his heel. So clearly, he was crucified, and then he ends up in an ossuary, actually in a grave. Um, so it could sometimes happen. There's also references in Josephus to him going and asking for the bodies of his friends that he sees on crosses during the war. So it may well be that, particularly at festival time, the governor may have been sort of predisposed to allow people to bury the dead, particularly since there's a passage in Deuteronomy that says that if people are left up on the cross overnight, it's a curse on the land. But that's to say that Jesus might have had a burial is a completely different thing to then say that he was buried in a rich man's tomb. Um, I can see very many reasons why early Christians wanted to give Jesus a good and decent burial, to have him buried in a lovely grave, and also so that the women could definitely come back to a place, a very clearly defined place later on the Sunday. But I do think it's probably more likely that Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the council whose job it was to just dispose of the bodies after crucifixion. There's even a passage in the Mishnah that talks about a field that was used for burial of people who'd been executed. So I think it's much more likely that Jesus had a fairly ignominious burial, maybe some kind of a shallow grave somewhere with other robbers, other people who'd been killed as well. And that in time, Christians started to sort of reimagine the grave. And you can see some of this changing in the gospel narratives themselves. So, it's Joseph's own grave, and then it's Joseph's own new grave. So there's nobody else there. And all of these details keep getting added that sort of gives Jesus this better burial. So yeah, I would make a distinction between a burial of any kind and a burial in a rich man's tomb.
Do you see evidence in the text of the later Gospels, the Gospels after Mark, that they're including what might appear to be historical details about the crucifixion that Mark left out? Or do you primarily just look at Mark and see all the other changes as just additions or changes to the story?
Hmm. I absolutely think later texts can contain historical details. I mean, there's absolutely no problem in that. If they have a better source, a different source, they could have something that's more historical. The difficulty is that they seem largely to be dependent on Mark. So Matthew is very dependent on Mark. He has some details that we've talked about already: Jesus, Barabbas, Pilate washing hands. It's possible that he has a historical tradition for those, but my guess is that probably he doesn't, because they so fit into his theological agenda. Um, Again, it's possible. Luke and John actually change Mark much more substantially than Matthew does. It's possible that there are some details there, but again, I'm a bit skeptical about all of this. In years gone by, people used to think that John didn't know Mark and was an independent tradition. And if you think John is an independent tradition, then it becomes very interesting what he has in common with Mark. But if, like me, you think that John is also dependent on Mark, then you really just have this literary connection between all of the Gospels, and that obviously makes it very difficult to know whether they are actually supplying any new information or not. And of course, I mean, we don't know with Mark. It just happens to be that Mark is our earliest source, and it's very hard to get back behind Mark.
What do John and Mark agree on when it comes to the details of the crucifixion?
Well, quite a lot. So I mean, sort of slight differences. So in I suppose the people involved, John has Caiaphas. He introduces Annas, another high priest, the father-in-law of Caiaphas. But again, it's that sort of priestly group. Pontius Pilate, the same people broadly are involved. In John's gospel, it he has a much more sort of quiet interrogation at nighttime between. He has a quiet interrogation at nighttime, just Jesus and the high priest, and then the following morning you have a much longer account of the trial, in which Pilate is sort of coming in and out and having these very esoteric conversations with Jesus. Um, but there are still some things in common with Mark. You have the story of Barabbas is there too. The theme throughout is about kingship. Is Jesus the King of the Jews? And of course, that's the title on the cross that Jesus gets killed under later on. So yeah, you still get quite a lot of similarities, and that question of choice, putting the blame for sending Jesus to the cross on representatives of the Jews.
Do you see John as primarily using Mark, or do you also think he knew Matthew and Luke and therefore was influenced by their narratives of the crucifixion, their versions of it as well?
It's difficult to know. I definitely think John is using Mark. I mean, a lot of my work has been sort of comparing elements across the different Gospels, and nearly always when I compared Mark and John, I always thought John is kind of seeing something in Mark and he's making it sort of into a bigger deal. So, he sees an element in Mark and he sort of rewrites it in his own way. I never really saw it quite to the same extent in Matthew and Luke. So I'm a lot more agnostic on whether he knows those Gospels. Though I do think in other places, I mean, certainly the resurrection narratives in Luke are very similar to what we have in John. So I do think that perhaps shows that John does know Luke as well. Matthew is a lot harder, though I know that Mark Goodacre and James Barker have both written recently and argued that John does know Matthew. I mean, there's no reason why not. I think once you think he knows two of the Gospels, why not three? And I think he probably is writing quite a lot later, maybe early 2nd century, something like that.
And my final question, what do you think Mark's goal was when he was writing about the crucifixion in the way that he wrote about it? What is he taking with the historical narrative and trying to turn it into? What's going on there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, I mean, crucifixion is the most shameful death there is. It's a slave's death. That's what Romans call it, the slave's death. It's so hideous that they don't even sort of describe it. Our narratives in the Gospels are very unusual in that they are lengthy accounts of crucifixion. So I think the difficulty for Mark is that everybody knew that Jesus was crucified. You couldn't change that element. He can change a lot of other things, but he's got to end up with Jesus on the cross at the end. And he doesn't try to make Jesus's death noble in the way that I think Luke does to a large extent, or triumphant like John does. He has Jesus in this sort of magnificently lifted up at the end, and he says, "It is finished," and that's sort of, the first part of his ascent to the Father. For Mark, though, I think the death of Jesus very much links in with his preaching. I mean, the central core of Jesus's teaching in Mark is that you have to deny yourself. You have to be the last. You have to be like a servant, like a slave. And in many ways, Jesus's terrible death on the cross is the ultimate example of what it means to make yourself a slave. Jesus makes himself a slave. He denies himself completely so as to ransom people from all the things that oppress them. So I think it's a sort of an acted parable in a way. It's an acted out version of Jesus's teaching in Mark's gospel. Though I'm not sure that the other gospel writers particularly liked that. And I think that's why, Luke makes it much more noble and John does his own thing in making it much more victorious.
And I'd like to remind everybody the link to purchase the New Insights into the New Testament 2025 will be in the description below and in the pinned comment just below that. And that being said, Helen Bond, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.